Alright, so today we're going to look at this idea of crisis management, alright? Unit 5.7, once again, HR only. So, when we look at crisis management, a crisis is, what do you call it? A crisis is the situation of instability that poses a major problem or threat to the business. So, it is the situation of instability that poses a major threat, okay? That is, I think, the key words you should take out of the crisis. It is something that is unstable, unpredictable, you don't expect to happen, that poses big threats to your business. Otherwise, it's not a crisis. So the characteristics of a crisis, as I was saying, was it's unpredictable, okay? It's something that you don't expect to occur, it just happens. It is something that threatens the organization, it harms the organization, and it needs quick decisions to be made because it's a big impact. You need to resolve it immediately. All right. So in order to deal with crisis management, we have two ways. We have crisis management and we have contingency planning. All right. So crisis management is just the most basic form and is the traditional, usually it's kind of like a traditional method, all right, of the response of an organization to a crisis. All right. It is literally just what organizations do to when there's a crisis. All right, this can literally be anything because a crisis can be anything. That's why the definition is so vague. But the typical measures of a crisis management is you implement radical measures in order to combat this radical instability. You impose a centralized decision making because once again you need decisions to be made quick, and once again you go to an autocratic leadership because you need to have that centralized decision making. You need to go make quick decisions, and you can't do that without an autocratic leadership. This is why, like as I said back in HR unit 5.2, this idea of a mixed situational leader, okay, is really great because you can switch to autocratic during crises, but during times of just normal business hours, you can go democratic, laissez-faire to please your workspace workers. So these are typical responses of crisis management. But what is contingency planning? Contingency planning is crisis management, but it is the idea of being a lot more cautious, aware, and the next step after crisis management. It is anticipating possible threats and developing plans on these unwanted outcomes by asking what if questions. It's like you make before a crisis happens by asking, what if my business experiences this? What if this happens? What if this happens? Okay, I have a plan if that happens. I have a plan if this happens. I have a plan if that happens. Now, this is very common within like airline industries, maybe train industries, transport industries, because their contingency planning is central, because if a crisis occurs, that is their entire brand themselves. So what is the main difference between crisis management and contingency planning? Crisis management is reactive. It occurs once a crisis is occurred. Contingency planning is what we call proactive. It is anticipating and planning these crises, and then being so much more efficiently able to deal with them when they actually come. So yeah, that is the differences and the basics of it. So we moved on to contingency planning as a whole. So now we're going to talk about the factors of contingency planning first. So when it comes to contingency planning, there are four main things that derive the whole contingency planning, all right? We have transparency, we have communication, speed, and control, okay? So during a crisis, when you have implemented a contingency plan, or when you're in the crisis, these are the four factors you need to maintain, all right? So first, the transparency. This is because most experts believe that it is the best method to deal in a crisis is to be very transparent, very honest in a crisis. Because this idea of denial and dishonest responses can lead to significant damages to your organization, because it could maybe damage the trust you have built between your workers and your employers. And then secondly, we have this idea of communication. Effective communication with all key stakeholders. Now, that is really hard, but it is crucial, okay? So stuff like a crisis communication plan is something you develop in your contingency plan, all right? Because you're going to have so many different key stakeholders as a business owner that you have to deal with, okay? So making this communication plan should be deployed because you don't want them making rash decisions. You don't want shareholders potentially pulling out or anything like that. So you need to make sure you're communicating with them with transparency. And speed. Obviously, speed is a critical response, okay? It is crucial, okay, to be very speedy, very instant, very quick decision making, all right? Because you don't want the crisis to affect you for longer and longer and longer. You need to get rid of it as quick as possible, all right? And control, okay? Leaders need to be able to control their situations, control the crises, make sure it doesn't develop into something bigger, all right? This requires an ability to work under pressure, this communication with all, this quick and effective decision making, instant access to funds so you can instantly maybe pay stuff or maybe get stuff you need to sort. So in order to deal with crises, the factors of contingency plan, you need a mix of transparency, communication, speed, and control. You need to be transparent with your stakeholders. You need to communicate transparently with your stakeholders. You need to communicate transparently with all your stakeholders super quickly. Make sure they know in an instant. And then you need to have control over every single one of these factors and every other factor of the crisis to ensure you come out of the crisis as good as possible. Now, why should or shouldn't we have a contingency plan, okay? Basically, firstly, a contingency plan can help us minimize our financial and reputational costs for when a crisis actually comes, all right? Because we have that plan, we know what to deal with, so it can minimize the damages to our reputation and finances. Like if we think about Delta Airlines is an airline that has obviously, since in the airline industry, has lots of contingency plans, like I said. One of its planes crashed, all right? So within 20 minutes, every single family member of that of the people who the plane crashed, they got given a financial sum of remuneration and compensation, all right? No one was killed, thankfully. So everyone on the flight was also instantly offered this compensation, okay? And this was instant, okay? This was having control over the situation, instantly with speed, this communication and transparency, openness and honesty, okay? And then that just fully minimized the reputation cost it has to Delta as a brand. And then it will also save you valuable time when you have a contingency plan because you have a structure of what you want to do. So it helps you factor that speed aspect, okay? It helps you just act quicker. It also reduces the impact that a crisis could have because you're able to combat it a lot more effectively. And it reassures your staff as well. It fulfills their safety needs and motivates them to keep working properly because the staff are reassured that something can be done if a crisis is to occur. Now, why shouldn't you have it, okay? So firstly, I think a big one is opportunity cost, okay? Like a crisis is obviously unpredictable. You never know if it's going to happen or not. So it always develops the opportunity cost for continuously making a constant continual contingency plan. So there's a big opportunity cost, okay? Secondly, the plans are not always a guarantee, okay? Your plans might not be accurate, they might not be appropriate as well. All right, you may have made a plan for one situation, but another situation came. You can't plan for every single thing. And third, you have to depend on the accuracy of your risk assessments, all right? And you ensure that they are very accurate so that your contingency plans will actually be effective. So yeah, that is crisis management.